In this second part of our series, we will begin to trace the history of God's Sabbath institution from its creation to the modern age. In doing so, we will allow the history given to us by God within the inspired Scriptures to vindicate the truth from the reproach of many who say that God's Sabbath institution pertains only to the Jews, a reproach commonly urged by God's own people against His Sabbath day. Modern Christianity so often gives the Sabbath of God to the Jews. However, when God created, blessed, and set apart His Sabbath day, there was no class of persons to whom it could be exclusively given. There was only God's creation, which consisted of one man, one woman, and the animals and vegetation of the land and sea. And it was for these, and ultimately for all of mankind, that God created the Sabbath. The Sabbath of God did not begin or end with a class of people. Instead, its beginning lies with the creation of the world, and its ending with the lasting of eternity. For the benefit of our first parents, who were the only inhabitants of the earth at the beginning of time, the 7 days of the weekly cycle were measured off, and the seventh day set apart for them by the Creator for holy use in memory of His own rest. That is, the seventh day was a day in which all work was laid aside by our first parents, whose responsibility it was to dress and keep the garden of God, and this sacred day was to be observed by them and the whole of creation in memory of their Creator's rest from His work. Listen to the true words of Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer to whose theology much of the modern Christian world gives credence. Quote, "It follows from hence that if Adam had stood in his innocency, yet he should have kept the seventh day holy. That is, on that day he should have taught his children, and children's children, what was the will of God, and wherein his worship did consist. He should have praised God, given thanks, and offered. On other days he should have tilled his ground, looked to his cattle." End quote. And such has been the passing of godly knowledge and instruction from one generation to the next, from the beginning of time until now. Adam lived until Lamech, the father of Noah, was 56 years old, and Lamech until Shem, the son of Noah, was 93 years old, and Shem until God's faithful servant Abraham was 150 years old. And God speaks these words regarding His servant Abraham, the one chosen among the idolatrous world to be the depositary of His law, at the center of which is His holy Sabbath. Quote, "I know Abraham, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment." End quote. And of Abraham it is further recorded, quote, "He obeyed God's voice and kept His charge, His commandments, His statutes, and His laws." End quote. And thus it is taught by the words of God and the pattern of the Scriptures that the knowledge of God and His law is and has always been preserved on earth through the lineage of man. Adam, the first who was born of God from the dust of the earth, lived 930 years as a witness to his descendants of the creation and of the fall of mankind. And it was through the lineage of Adam's descendant Noah that God preserved His law upon the earth, even through the destructive waters of the great flood. And it was through the lineage of Adam's descendant Abraham that God preserved His law upon the earth after the great flood and until the coming of the Messiah. And after the coming of the Messiah, it is through His redeemed people, who now share in the lineage of Adam and Abraham through their faith in Jesus Christ, that God preserves His law today and forevermore. Jesus Himself honored and regarded the Sabbath of His Father in both life and in death. He spoke of it in relation to the past, present, and future. Likewise, the apostles and the early church continued to regard the Sabbath of God long after the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. And God reveals through His prophet Isaiah that His Sabbath would be eternally regarded in the new heaven and new earth. If the Sabbath of God was regarded by our first parents, by their lineage and throughout the ages of our patriarchal fathers, and throughout the ages of Israel's great judges and kings, and by God's own Son and our Savior Jesus Christ when he walked upon the earth, and by his devoted apostles and the early church, which was established across the Mediterranean and ultimately the entire world by their ministry. And the Sabbath of God is to be eternally regarded in the new heaven and new earth. How have we become the only age in time so deceived and filled with such pride, so as to believe that we alone are exempt from the law of God? We have become the only age that has ever tampered with or attempted to change the immutable and perfect commandments of God. We have become the only age who has dared to sanctify our own day through man-made customs and traditions, and to not only change, but to speak against and profane the only day which God himself sanctified from the foundation of the world. For this ignorance and sin, may God forgive us and open our eyes. The Scriptures cry aloud regarding the fact that the earthly ministry and ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ did not work to destroy the foundation of God's eternal government, nor did it compromise the standard of God's spiritual law represented by the Ten Commandments. The rigidity and unchanging nature of God's law was the essence of our human dilemma. It was impossible for man to achieve God's perfect standard with a heart that had been corrupted by sin. Man stood condemned under the penalty of God's uncompromising law. The sacrificial death of God's Son, Jesus Christ, magnified the immutable and unchanging nature of God's law. It was and will always be undeniable proof that God's law can never be changed. Man's transgression of God's law invoked its strict penalty, which was and is eternal death and separation from God, our Creator. Death was a necessary consequence of the law, and a payment that was demanded by it without exception. However, the good news of this age is that the payment was made for us by God's Son, Jesus Christ. He fulfilled or satisfied the penalty of God's law by sacrificing his life for ours. By this ultimate and unparalleled sacrifice, Jesus did not reduce or take away from the eternal law of his Father. No, he did quite the opposite. He established all of it. During these critical last days, God is shedding a renewed light on this present truth. It is important that we as God's people understand the perfect balance between God's law and God's grace, because there will soon come a day when we will be asked by great earthly authority to compromise the law of God in testing of our love and fidelity to our Creator. And we must be ready to stand firm in our faith and be neither forced nor deceived into subtle and destructive compromise.